Welcome to those of you who are logged on to Coffee and Conversation with the Artists. This is our second presentation in an 8-month series of artist presentations. And as most of you know, it's organized by the Sterling Society, which is an auxiliary group that puts on programs to educate and entertain and support the Arts Center. These programs here currently are free because we don't have a way to actually charge for non-members, but normally they're a $5 donation from non-members when they come to the Coffee and Conversation. So I'm Diane Van Dusen, a former Sterling Society board member. I volunteer at the Arts Center in the gift shop, and I'm this year's coordinator for Coffee and Conversation. As I mentioned, Sarah Kessinger, the Sterling Society president, at some point will be joining us, and maybe she'll do at the end of the talk a little wrap up on other events coming up that the Sterling Society is putting on. So again, thanks to Diane Wheatley Gelati, the sponsor for this year's program. She's been very active at the Dunedin Fine Arts Center. She was part of the group that helped set up the bylaws for the Sterling Society, served on the DFAC board as president, and provided leadership to the Creative Visions campaign for the Flack East Wing at the Arts Center. So as I've mentioned already, we're going to ask everybody to be muted once the presentation starts. And if you do have questions throughout the presentation, you can type your questions in the chat box, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. And then at the end, we'll have a question and answer session, and I'll look at those chat questions, and that's how we'll handle it. So today's artist is Julia Buntaine Hoel. Whose works are featured in the Vespertine exhibit at DFAC through December 24 of this year. And her talk today, an overview of her artistic practice, will focus on exploring science through art. Julia is a conceptual artist and founding executive director of Sci-Art Initiative. Julia attained her double BA in Neuroscience and Sculpture from Hampshire College. Her post-baccalaureate certificate in studio art from Maryland Institute College of Arts, and her Master of Fine Arts from the School of Visual Arts. She has exhibited nationally and internationally, including shows in New York City, Washington, D.C., Amherst, Baltimore, Seattle, Madison, Princeton, London, Toronto, and I don't know how to pronounce this other city, Knokke. How is that pronounced, Julia?
I also don't know how to pronounce it, but it's in Belgium.
Okay, in Belgium, Sofia, and other areas. Her work can be found in the permanent collection of New York University and Johns Hopkins University, and has been featured in the New York Times, Forbes, Smithsonian Magazine, and Hyperallergic Magazine, among others. She also teaches, consults, curates, and frequently writes about art, and currently holds positions at Pratt Institute, Montserrat College of Art, and Merrimack College. So welcome, Julia, and I'm going to mute myself now, and anybody else that is not muted, please do so, because we don't want to have background noise. So find the little button.
Where would I mute?
Click on your photo on your screen, and when you click on it, there'll be a little button that says mute.
I don't see myself anywhere.
Try the bottom left of your Zoom window. There's a little microphone icon next to the video cam icon.
So if you're on a laptop.
Yeah, I am.
Okay, go to the bottom of the screen, and you should see at the far left a little mini microphone that has a arrow next to it. And if you touch that arrow, it'll mute you. I
think also as the organizer, if you look at the list of participants, you should be able to mute people from your
end.
end.
How can I mute myself here?
Yeah, I'm gonna mute you, I think. Let's see if it worked. Last time it didn't always work.
It looks like she got it.
Okay, and I'm gonna mute myself. So we're all ready to.
Okay, well, thank you so much to the Sterling Society for hosting me and inviting me to give this talk about my work. And thank you so much for the introduction. Again, my name is Julia Buntaine Hoel. I'm a conceptual artist, a professor, and a nonprofit leader. And today I'm going to talk about my work in the art science realm. So as an artist, I draw inspiration from neuroscience. I'm interested in the biological underpinnings of our experience of being human. And I find cellular and molecular biology endlessly fascinating and beautiful. I'm also deeply interested in higher order phenomenon like perception, memory, and consciousness, and theories on how these mechanisms work. We know a lot about the brain. We know nothing about the brain. It's a new science in terms of the history of science. Neuroscience is about 50, 60 years old. So we've discovered a lot, but there's so much left undiscovered. And this is really where I operate as an artist. So as was mentioned, I double majored in neuroscience and sculpture in college, and it didn't take too long before I began to make artwork about what I was studying in the laboratory. And so it was back then that the brain really became my artistic muse. And this is because I find it beautiful. I find biology beautiful. I find the way that the brain works to be very compelling and mysterious and inspirational. And again, given how much we still have to understand about the brain, I suspect I'll be making this type of work for a very long time. It's already been well over a decade. And this piece that we're looking at here, the neural correlate of concrete, this was the first full work that I ever made about the brain. It's a sized up anatomical model of the brain made from styrofoam on the inside and coated with a layer of concrete on the outside. This brain was installed on my college campus for a few years, and then it lived on my parents' lawn for a little while. And then 2 summers ago, it was installed in Worcester, Massachusetts, Elm Park Biennial. So that's where it is pictured here. This is a close-up shot of the surface in which I carved sort of nodes with interconnecting lines. This alludes to the idea of neural networks and interconnectivity and communication between neurons. They also kind of look like constellations. And the title of this piece, The Neural Correlate of Concrete, is a play on what's called the neural correlate of consciousness, which is defined as the minimal neural mechanisms that are together necessary and sufficient for experiencing any conscious perception. So this is one theory of consciousness. And in this piece, I was simultaneously exploring kind of consciousness, but also sculptural materials and concrete techniques and ways in which to represent the brain. This was the largest piece I had made up to this point. It weighs about 400 pounds and continues to be like a problem child because I never know where to put it and it's very difficult to move around, but it's looking for a home. My parents will move eventually, but it has a nice home in Massachusetts right now in the woods. So back around the time that I made the neural correlate of concrete, we're talking 2010 or so, I was working a lot in concrete. I was exploring it as an artist, interested in materials and what materials can do. And I liked the idea of making the ever-changing, ever-moving forms of biology permanently still, sort of frozen in time. And I was also making a lot of big work at this time and doing things like making the micro macro, making very small biological forms very, very large. And through doing this, I'm able to confront my viewers with biology on a really human scale, making the invisible visible. And this is a technique that I and many artists employ frequently because when you confront something on a human scale, it gives you this physical, emotional experience, which is very difficult to achieve when something is too small for the eye to see. And so this piece is called Chemical Play. It's a comment on both the pharmaceutical drug industry and attitudes towards recreational drugs. And here we have a version of a miniature golf course with odd structures sticking up as the obstacles and the holes. These sculptural components, the forms in white, are modeled after very specific biological forms called G protein coupled receptors. I think I have a detail shot here. Yes, I do. So on the left is a detail shot of the piece, and on the right is a scientific diagram of what I'm talking about for reference. So too small for our best microscopes to see, we've only measured the presence of G protein coupled receptors. And thus their shapes here in both my work and the scientific diagram on the right are basically approximations calculated by mathematics. But we know everything about what they do. These receptors are nested within the surface of a cell, and they span the cell wall, protruding on both the outside and inside of the cell. Proteins of various kinds, including drugs, will bind with these receptors and cause what's called a conformational change. And a change in the shape of the receptor causes a cascade of reactions within the cell, which ultimately leads to gene expression. So this is really a lot of how biology works on the cellular level. So you can think about these white forms as the tops of these receptors and the astroturf as the surface of the cell. There's no way to win the game in my artwork piece here. The balls just get shuffled around. Their placement is completely random and meaningless. And the way that drugs work in our brain is often similar. Why certain drugs work for some people but not others appears to be random and unpredictable, or at least a bit beyond our current scientific reach. It doesn't really mean anything that an SSRI, like an antidepressant, helps some and hurts others. Know why. And drugs work well enough to be approved by the FDA. We all have the same basic stuff. We all have the same basic structures in biology. But the fact that we each have unique, individualized brains makes a world of difference. So in many of my works like this one, my goal is not to assert an opinion, but rather be the catalyst for conversation. This work is from the same time period. It's also made from concrete, and it represents the form of a motor neuron, which is the type of neuron that's responsible for motor, meaning movement activity. This piece is called Spike, which speaks to the electrical impulses that neurons use to spark communication with one another. Many of my works come back to the form of the neuron, as you'll see throughout my talk. Neurons branch like trees and rivers and veins and fractals. Their structures are impeccable, significant, delicate, and beautiful. I follow the latest in neuroscience research to stay up to date on findings and gather new sources of inspiration. During the Obama administration, the brain mapping initiatives were founded worldwide. The quest to map the brain has resulted in a secondary mapping, that of the negative space of the brain. So as an artist, negative space is always of interest to me, and this piqued my interest. Negative space in the brain, there's not much of it. The brain is well organized and optimized for its space capacity. But the negative space in the brain can be found at the place where neurons meet one another, at their synapse, their point of communication and connection. Between two neurons connecting, there is a gap, and that's where chemicals flow across and impulses are exchanged. This gap was long thought to be just a small space shaped probably like a disc or a donut. That's how it's represented in scientific illustrations. In reality, these gaps are much weirder. These sculptures give dimension to the negative space between mapped neurons. Each synaptic gap is different, and their shapes don't appear to follow any rules or templates. Is one more successful than another? Is one responsible for certain types of neurotransmitters over another? These are things that we don't know. These pieces are sized to fit in the palm of one's hand, sort of as shapes for contemplation. They're made out of clay. I also do quite a bit of work digitally, as you'll see, where the majority of the work happens in Photoshop, and then I print on whatever material suits the piece best. This enables me to take data and directly manipulate it into my aesthetic and conceptual ends. This diptych is a city brain work. The city in the brain is a thread that I follow that I'll talk a little bit about. This piece is called Neighborhoods, where the left work is based on a Google Maps view of a neighborhood that I lived in the East Village in New York a number of years ago. And the right side is a cross-section of the frontal cortex. The colors here are incidental. They act as sort of abstract aesthetic elements, but really it was, the aim of this piece was just a visual comparison of two very different kinds of neighborhoods. Another city brain piece. This piece is called Broadman Subways, and it is a melding between Broadman's brain map and the map of the New York City subway system. So just a bit about Broadman's brain map. This was the data that I was inspired by. It was the first cortical map ever made by Corbini and Broadman in the late, I believe it was 18th century. And basically he mapped the cortex and understood that there were different types of cells which made up the cortex, the outer layer of the brain. And so he made a map of these different cell types by using different symbols to demarcate the different geographies of the cortex surface. I like the idea of the brain being a city and the city being a brain because they share a lot in common, at least metaphorically. The subway lines of communication, the telephone wires, the electricity, all of the things that connect a city resemble, again, at least metaphorically, the way that a brain is hyper-connected in many different ways between neuron to mini bundles and clusters from hemisphere to hemisphere. The city is always changing. Brains are always changing. They don't just sit there. They're always in motion. They are growing new connections. They are losing old connections. So I made this piece while I lived in New York. And what I did is I cut up a subway map into pixels, essentially squares. And I grouped all of the squares based on certain principles of likeness. So all of the squares that had 4 subway lines running through them would go into one group. All of the squares which had 1 subway line and a water body in it would go into another group, so on and so forth. So I ended up with about 38 groups of cell types and mapped them onto the surface of this brain model. There are many ways that science represents the brain, like Broadman's map, which is a very old representation, but still interesting. And I find the way that science represents the brain to be inherently interesting because it's an aesthetic choice, ultimately, made by a scientist or a software engineer about what exactly the data is going to look like. So this series of waves looks at the technology EEG, which stands for electroencephalogram. EEG measures brain waves, of which there are 5 types. It's much like EKG for hearts, but just more complicated because the brain has more types of waves. And I wanted to see what brain waves, which are typically seen on a computer screen, would look like as drawings in space. So pictured here are alpha, theta, and beta. Those are 3 types of brainwaves. I made these works by creating templates for each brainwave and bent the waveform in wire repeatedly until there were enough to create a form of their own. They are held together by tension only. These brainwave sculptures created their own form through stacking and intertwining each wave with its own copies. They took on the shapes which ultimately feel like some sort of small creature or animal. They're pictured here on pedestals, although typically they're floor works. And to give you a sense of scale, the right side wave, which is the alpha wave, is about 2.5 feet long and 1.5 feet tall. Still thinking about EEG, this work is called EE Jellyfish, and it actually uses the tools of science itself as the aesthetic objects. Here's an installation of the group of jellyfish. These hanging forms are EEG headsets. They are what a scientist would put over your head to study the electricity that is emitted from your scalp, which is indicative of brain activity. And I've transformed them here into jellyfish forms, which hang like these sort of underwater creatures. Embedded in the top of the sculptures are LED lights, which change over the rainbow color spectrum on a loop, which gives them sort of this sense of life, sense of pulsating life. So I clearly am a fan of neuroscience. I'm a fan of the brain, but that doesn't mean that I'm not critical of the field as well. I see it for what it is. Again, it's a baby science. It has discovered some amazing things, but it has a long way to go before it has really solid ground to stand on like a science like chemistry does. And while I try with my work to reveal the wonders that neuroscience has discovered, I also occasionally like to reveal science's limitations. This piece, what we see, is both a statement and a question. Here's a detail shot. In each frame, there is an image of stimuli from real neuroscience of vision studies. So neuroscientists would create images and do create images like these and measure people's responses to them in order to understand how we perceive and make sense of the visual world. These stimuli, acting as stand-ins for real-world visual experience, are created with specific questions in mind, like how quickly do we notice anomalies in a visual field? How much visual information do we need to recognize an object? Does the nature of an object change depending on its context? If a face is 50% blurry versus 35% blurry, do we recognize the 35% or only the 50%, or does it have to be 65% before we get that face? These are things very easily studied with technologies like EEG and fMRI and others. So while these questions are very interesting in their own right, they beg their own question for me, which is, do these tailored images have any reduced resemblance to the experience, to the real experience of our visual world? Are these images here in any way what we actually see? And what are we learning in the lab? What aren't we learning in the lab about our visual experience? Another theme, as I have touched upon that runs through my work, is perception. Visual perception is of high interest to me as a visual artist for obvious reasons. This piece is called Verticality. It is 6 feet by 6 feet in total, and there's a detail shot on the right there. It is made from 3/4-inch mirror tiles and is both a mirror and a topographical map of the cells in the visual cortex, which respond to vertical stimuli. Because the visual cortex has specialized cells. Some respond to vertical things, some respond to horizontal things. That's why we're so good at seeing trees versus horizons. And seeing vertical things is really important to humans. So the kind of structure of the visual cortex probably has deep roots in evolution. But this is just a mirror of the vertical, as it were. This is another piece about perception called Visual Objective. And this piece shows what the world looks like to the eye before the brain has a chance to process the incoming information. So most people have heard that the retina is much like a camera lens where the image is flipped and reversed. That's true. We also have some other interesting things about our eye's anatomy that makes the image coming in look really different than what we actually perceive once our brain processes that information. For example, we don't see images in rectangles or squares like photographs. Many people kind of default to that, but we actually see the world in this lumpy oval shape where the bump up at the bottom is for the bridge of your nose, and so on and so forth. At the very edge of the image, we lose definition, we lose color. This is our periphery. In the middle of the image, around where that very colorful purse is at the top, there is what's called the fovea, which is the most focused part of our vision. And it's a very tiny part within our visual field, but there's actually a center of focus there. And those two white dots that are on either side, those are actually blind spots because of the way our eye's anatomy works. There are two blind spots built in where the optic nerve is. There are no recepting cells because the nerve bundle is there. So we actually have two blind spots in our visual field, but you'd never know it unless you read about it because our brain just fills in the information. And if you want to explore your blind spots, you can look up online how to find them. And it's a very simple task of holding out your finger to a certain length and moving it around and keeping your eyes at a fixed point. But I think it's amazing that, we never experience the world the way this image shows us because our brain flips it, reverses it, fills stuff in, and makes us feel like we have this very kind of easy experience of the visual world. And this is my piece included in Vespertine. This piece asks, are the eye tracking movements of looking at an artwork artful in themselves? Is there beauty in the looking pattern of a beautiful picture? Is an inherent aesthetic blueprint revealed? The picture an observer is looking at must inherently be present in their eye movement patterns around the image. And while each drawing here, which is based on scientific data, varies according to the viewer's intent and context, there emerges similar patterns throughout. To capture the eye movements of a viewer is then to capture what the viewer is observing. In this way, the recorded movements become a separate representation of the artwork, sort of like a trace. Would other viewers, if recorded, have similar eye tracking patterns? Would viewing an abstract work elicit similar patterns among viewers or patterns based on personal experience? These 7 drawings explore this idea. The topmost image is the painting, The Unexpected Visitor. And the painting is by the Russian artist Ilya Repin. The 3 images of the drawings I have here are part of this series, and they show the eye tracking data that I enlarged and emphasized to create the artwork. So you can kind of see how there are clusters, those dense knotted clusters are in similar places in each of these drawings as the viewer was asked to determine the age of the people in this painting, determine the relationship between the people in this painting, and so on. And the clusters in this image, more often than not, end up overlapping with the faces of the people in the painting. And that is a very human thing to do, is to look at faces. That's how we understand the world around us and understand people, is through facial cues. So this is the piece that I have included in the gallery exhibit. So I told you we would return to neurons, and here we are. This is the largest 2D work that I've made so far. It's called For Pollock, as in Jackson Pollock. In this piece, color is one of the main points. I wanted to elicit as much of my viewers' visual cortex as possible with bright and high contrast palettes to give you some sense of scale. This piece is 6 feet by 6 feet. And what it's composed of are neurons that I mined from a lab at MIT. So I've overlaid 100 neurons here. I've obviously changed their scale and changed their color, but I have not changed their form. I've changed their arrangement to look like this messy web, eliciting that sort of abstract expressionist style that Pollock was so well known for. But instead of them being random, lines and action painting type movements that created the form here, it's real biology from somebody's actual brain. And I created this piece in a grid-like structure to kind of elicit the idea that you could kind of switch squares out and move them around, but as soon as you do, the whole picture falls apart. So even though it's very hard and in fact impossible to track all of the connections between each of the grid pieces, they are integral to holding the whole piece together. This is printed on aluminum. Here's a closer photo. And this is the most recent series that I've made, which there's 10 total. I'm going to show you just a handful. This piece is probably the most personal work that I've made and looks really different than a lot of my other work, so I always like to share it. Rather than addressing neuroscience, here I am talking about the less physical side of the brain, which is that of mental health. I was actually interested in mental health and disorders of the mind long before I found neuroscience. As a teenager, I explored abandoned mental hospitals around Massachusetts for fun with my friends, to the chagrin of my parents. But I wasn't just doing it for fun. I found these places very beautiful and was taking photographs and making artwork based on it. And here I am again doing the same thing so many years later. In the 1990s, many mental hospitals were closed across the United States in tandem with the rise of the pharmaceutical industry and other ways of treating and helping those with mental illnesses. Neuroscience has revealed very little the cause of mental illnesses, even though we know a little bit about how they can be treated. And indeed, part of the issue lies in being able to define what a normal brain is. Is there one person out there who's quote unquote normal and the rest of us are measured up against that? I don't think so. But what is normal and what is that bar that we're trying to reach? We all share the same fundamental biology, but we all are different as well. So this image is from my series, My Life as a Lunatic. The title and the overlaid text in each work are sourced from my great-grandfather's self-published book, which recounts his time as a mental patient in the Arkansas Lunatic Asylum in the early 1900s. Whether my great-grandfather was truly ill or extremely eccentric for his time will never be known. But he was hospitalized against his will, and his account of hospitalization veers from matter of fact into fantastical language and back again, in between revealing truths about how people like himself were treated and what sorts of conditions they lived in. So portions of his text are overlaid onto photos that I took at Medfield State Hospital, which is in Massachusetts, and that I grew up nearby. The grounds are still open, although the buildings are very much closed. And these photographs have been purposefully altered, where some buildings appear out of focus, shifting in reality. When nothing else is left, buildings are containers for the history which occurred within them. So this is another thing that I think a lot about. So when I began making art about the brain 11 or 12 years ago, I set out with a few aims, and I've added to them over time. So really my aims as an artist is to share the wonders of biology through the universal language of art, to examine scientific data and equipment with the tools of aesthetics, to start conversations about biology, mental health, and neuroscience as a discipline, and really to maintain the integrity of the science while making it accessible to all. So this is what I try to do with my work. And being an artist interested in science, I quickly realized a long time ago that the potential energy between art and science was vast and went far beyond my own arts practice. And it included much more than just art inspired or involving science. So I just wanted to, as I wrap up here, talk quickly about the nonprofit that I run, as it's very much a part of my artistic identity. So in 2014, I founded SciArt Initiative, and we've since then grown to become our own 501c3 nonprofit organization. Through our activities, we address the division between the humanities and the sciences, lamented by C.P. Snow in his famous 1959 speech, The Two Cultures. We have a number of programs that support the convergence, collaboration, and intersection of art and science. One of our main programs is exhibitions. Our exhibitions involve themes in science and technology, and we've held over 16 virtual and physical shows from Brooklyn to upstate New York to Los Angeles to Toronto to the UK. We partner with galleries and museums that are interested in our content, and we host shows in collaboration with partners. One of our regular partners is the New York Hall of Science in Queens and Super Collider Gallery in Los Angeles. And we've covered topics like weather, which relates to climate change, stem cell research, networks, food, biology, the Anthropocene, and more. We're about to open a show called Deep Fake, which is on kind of the difference between truth and reality as mediated by sources in the internet. And we also host monthly events. We have gone virtual, as many have, and but typically we host events in the Boston area and in the New York area. Our virtual events for the time being include a cross-disciplinary talk series called Laser, a lunch break series, which features professionals within the arts and sciences, and what we like to call our virtual mixer, which is just a networking event for people who are interested in meeting people outside of their own circles. We also have a publication called SciArt Magazine, where we publish about these types of topics and more. And we have a residency program which pairs artists and scientists and supports a collaboration of their own devising. So this is a little bit about us in case you're interested in visiting our website or following us on social media. I'm trying to angle myself out of the sun. Oops, not going to happen. And thank you so much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Julia. I haven't seen any questions pop up, but I do have a question. Does your foundation work at all with people that have mental health issues, since so much of your art is linked to the mind? And I'm just curious.
Great question. Yeah, no, not specifically. We typically create programs around themes. We have not done a theme around mental health, actually, but believe me, we have a long list of themes to get to. And that is definitely one of them as it becomes ever more relevant, and especially these times of COVID.
Mm-hmm. And anybody else in the group here wants to unmute themselves? I didn't see any questions pop up on the chat, but feel free to unmute. Isabel, let me unmute you. Looks like you wanted to say something. Oops. Okay. There yeah. Okay.
I just think it's absolutely fascinating, and it is a work that definitely needs to be done to delve into the human brain, because there is, like she said, so little we know about it, and I think her art is beautiful. I really loved it.
Thank you so much.
You.
So we have somebody in here who's raising their hand, but I don't see him.
Well, it's Michael Kahn. You can see my blue field if that's acceptable.
That's fine.
Julia, I wonder if you or in your group someone has delved into how science and art merge with inner space and the way down to the dendritic and axonal level in a neuron, there's patterns in nature that repeat themselves on an atomic, subatomic, and neuroscience level, as opposed to our world, the cosmos, and so forth. Is that a branch that's involved with the art you or some of your colleagues do?
I have not gotten that deep into biology, not yet. And that's mostly because our ability to visualize that, meaning scientists' ability to visualize that, is limited at this point. And so it would be, it would be more conjecture. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I usually make work from things that I can see, or at least somebody can see and show me. But I'm sure there are artists that delve into that level. I do know of one artist, his name is Jody Rash. I can share his name in the chat at the end. he definitely has created works that go a bit deeper. He doesn't always make work about neuroscience, but he's very interested in biology and things that get a little more subatomic.
Right, like I've read neuroscience journals, and they'll have ultrastructural electron microscope images that are part of the publication. And some of the patterns that are seen in the electron microscope images that are published are almost like natural works of art, because you see repeating patterns in them. And I just think it seemed to me it would be kind of a natural leap to take those kind of images and work and manipulate them to make them have an artistic expression of what that person's trying to pass on to the viewer of the work.
Certainly. And I know a number of scientists in neuroscience who work with data, day in and day out, but on their free time, they use their data to create artworks. And they have, these enormous data sets and are really able to delve into them and do some interesting things. One such artist, his name is Greg Dunn, 2 N's, and he's really fantastic. He creates these beautiful images of neurons. I'm not sure what layer he goes down to, as it were. But it's interesting when scientists produce images just for the sake of science that end up being so beautiful that people want to start calling them art or see these artistic elements within them, because nature is beautiful. Sometimes you don't have to do much to nature to really highlight its beauty.
Thank you for your reflections.
I was just looking at the chat, and it looks like we have a question from Chris Calkins, I believe it is. The question is, any artistic ideas regarding aspects of disassociation? I have dissociative identity disorder, used to be multiple identity disorder. Wondering about perceptions and reality on the, quote, inside world. And then we also had an earlier question from Linda Whitmerhouse-Masick. I don't see her now, but maybe you could address Chris Calkin's question about disassociation and dissociative identity disorder and perceptions and reality of the inside world.
The inside world is, everyone has their own inside world, right? I do not know much about dissociation disorder or identity disorder, so I don't feel particularly comfortable speaking to that. But for artists, so much of what artists try to do is make visual what they feel on the inside. And even though my work is rooted in data, if it were solely rooted in data, then I would just be giving you the data that it's based on. There's so many other factors that go into creating an artwork. Personal likes for colors or shapes or patterns or materials. I'm trying to think. I know that art therapy often delves into using art as a means to kind of cope or understand or better explore kind of the internal mental states to whatever end the person is interested in. And so art therapy is a rising field. It's a very interesting field. And I think that kind of towards this question, that would be something to look into, of interest. What has art therapy really figured out about linking kind of that internal inside state to visualizations or something more external.
I see that Lois Long, whose image is on the screen, has a little hand raised up. I didn't realize there was that option, so I believe she must have a question.
Yes, I do. First, I have a comment. I love the way you use metaphor and cross back and forth between, art and science. I love the jellyfish, the whole idea of using the scientific materials to explore this idea of the jellyfish and how beautiful it is in an aesthetic way. And I have a question. Do you consider yourself more an artist, a scientist? Are you sort of bipolar in a way? That's one question.
Sure. Did you want to see your second question and then I can answer both?
Okay, and then the other question is, I'm thinking of an old classic visual perception. I believe it's Rudolf Arnheim that wrote the book, where he talks about visual perception, and one of the many things that when I used to teach, you would have these like illustrations that were, well, probably the simplest I can think of is the line that has the arrow pointing in, and then the line that has the arrow pointing out, and it asks you which is longer. So we have these kind of perceptions. Sure. And if there's been any desire to explain exactly what's going on with those many perceptions. Okay.
Sure.
Two heavy questions here.
No. So I'll answer your first question first. I definitely am an artist, not a scientist. I have my bachelor's in neuroscience, but I decided not to become a scientist. That was a real decision I made for a few reasons, but primarily because I realized that while science is what I like to think about, art is what I like to do. And thinking about something and doing it and liking it, you have to really examine that if you get a chance to. So I was very lucky as an undergraduate to have the freedom to explore my interests in tandem. As a junior and senior in college, I was able to run pilot scientific studies using EEG headsets and developing my own protocols and analyzing data. And it was fascinating, and it gave me a real grounding in the science, but it also helped me understand I don't want to do this for a living. This is not interesting to me. The work is not interesting to me. What we find out and the concepts are interesting to me. So that's why I decided to just pursue art. But that being said, I married a scientist. I'm surrounded by scientists. So I stay as close as possible to the source. And as for kind of visual illusions and making pieces about that or that explore that, that's actually on my list of to-dos. A couple of years ago, I tried to make a piece about a visual illusion, but I couldn't get it quite right. I was trying to make a video that had a certain timing. There's that phenomenon where you, if you look at just like a red square and you look at it for a minute and you really concentrate on this red square, as soon as it disappears, you'll see this image of a green square because your red receptors are blown out and green is the opposite. So I was trying to make a piece along those lines, but I couldn't get it quite right, not yet at least. And yeah, as for other illusions, that's a whole undiscovered territory for me, but I appreciate the reminder.
Also, Victor Lowenfeld, a long time ago, he was a classic person in art education, divided artists kind of into a couple of groups. He called the haptic, or those that were more concerned with the expression emotional, and the visual perceptual. And the visual perceptual in some ways are on the edge of science. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting place to be, to explore it for its own sake, as opposed to how you feel about it. So
that's very true. And it's, if you analyze, certain paintings from a more scientific point of view, things are revealed. Like Jackson Pollock's paintings are made up of fractals. And that's actually how they authenticate his work now, because we know that he painted in a fractal-like way. And when people try to imitate that, they fail. Or you think about Seurat's, pointillism, and how that actually really represents, a lot of the way that we understand the world on a more cellular level. And so artists, there's this book by Jonah Lehrer called Proust Was a Neuroscientist. Artists are often at the kind of leading edge of understanding things conceptually. And then we find out later, oh yeah, that's how the science of it works.
Good.
The question that Linda Whitmerhouse-Masick posed on chat, she says, Julia, it seems most of the art you shared was inspired by physical biology, but your photos moved to the emotional expression. Are you continuing on both paths?
Great question. Yes, I'm definitely continuing on both paths. I didn't show some of my more conceptual pieces out of concern for time and wanting to focus on more pieces versus just a few. But if you check out my website, you can see some of them get kind of really weird and out there. Behind me, there's a set of canvases. I'm working on a painting right now that explores biology and forests and kind of intertwining neuronal forms with forms of trees. And so again, I'm always going back to the neuron. I don't think I'll ever kick it. But yeah, I'm interested in the more emotional side of things. I don't tend to make work about that, but it pops up sometimes. And I also am really interested in historically the way that science has understood the brain from the way William James talks about the brain in his Principles of Psychology, which was published in 1850, I have a piece called The Art of Memory, which examines the way that certain people thought the way memory works in the 16th century. So I do delve back into history sometimes as a different way of looking at the brain. Yeah, I never exactly know where I'm going to go next. I usually, I have a list of, like I said, I have a list of things I'd like to make work about, but sometimes I'm just waiting for that right data or those right set of things to come together to really form a piece in my mind. For me, I know what my pieces are going to look like before I start making them. That's why I call myself a conceptual artist. It's easy for me to visualize all the pieces in place and then make the work rather than starting from scratch and just kind of, seeing what happens. I used to work that way, but I like working this other way better. So sometimes it's just a matter of waiting around, see what neuroscience discovers tomorrow.
And just for everybody's information, these talks are recorded, and I pass the recording on to Ken Hannon at the Fine Arts Center, and he edits what needs to be edited out. And so they will be viewable if you want to look back at it again, or hear what all was said. They'll be on the website, I believe, up in the blog, up at the top of the website for Dunedin Fine Arts Center. So, and Julia, I can certainly send you a copy of the recording, so that you have that. So unless, I don't know if I don't see any other questions in the chat, I'd like to ask, and it's sort of personal, but is your grandfather still alive?
He is not, no. It was my great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, oh, okay.
And so, yeah, he passed a while ago. We still have, we still have family who knew him, kind of, but he's receding into the past, and as is his story. But his book is published in the Library of Congress. It's a published book. You won't find it on any bookshelves. But it's been kind of family project between a number of members of my family to collect all that we can about him and his story. And then it's actually inspired, an art project by me, obviously, and a few projects by my brother, who's an artist as well. So his story definitely lives on in various ways.
What is the name of the book?
The name of the book is called, My Life as a Lunatic.
Oh,
and his name is James Ward. So if you look on my website and you go to that piece on my portfolio page, there's more information about it there.
Okay. Yeah, I asked because I too had a family member that had spent some time in institutions, and when I saw those paintings, it flashed back to some visuals of an institution in Michigan. So I was curious about it. Well, I want to thank you so much. You've been great to work with, and clearly you have the technology skills, because I was trying to figure out how to do something earlier. So I thank you so much for that.
Oh, of course, that's what I get for being a college professor on Zoom now. It's I'll tell you, it's more complicated when you have 28 students and you're trying to keep them engaged over a 3-hour class session. So this was much more fun and easy. But it was such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And it looks like I might have one more question on here. Let's see. Another, I think, from Chris Hawkins. Any artistic ideas regarding, whoops, no, I can't see the whole thing. Nope, it disappeared. But there's a thank you from Linda. And let me just double check here. Lauren, just more thank yous on the chat. I don't see any other questions. So I see applause going on there. Thank you again so much, Julia. And for those of you who want to
Thank you
follow up,
all.
okay, great. Enjoy the rest of your
Thank
day.
you.
Okay,
Thank
we'll
you.
do-
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.